This is a macro revision video for the first topic of the macro course, Macroeconomic Fundamentals. Macroeconomics starts by recognising that we assume that the fundamental objective of government is maximising the welfare of citizens. We break that down into 4 major objectives as well as some other minor ones. Maximising the welfare of the citizens in a country means maximising economic growth, producing more goods and services for everybody. We measure this using changes in GDP, that's gross domestic product, the total amount produced in a year. GDP can be adjusted to form real GDP, adjusted for inflation, also known as GDP in constant prices. If we don't adjust GDP for inflation, which we'll meet shortly, we call it nominal GDP, or money GDP, or GDP in current prices. GDP per capita is another adjustment we make, which is GDP divided by population. And we can also convert GDP into a common currency using purchasing power parity exchange rates in order to compare between countries. Secondly, low unemployment. Governments want to maximise the number of people in work in order to maximise people earning under that remit of maximising their welfare. Full employment, when we have as many people in jobs as possible, is around 2 or 3%, and we'll see why in the unemployment topic. More jobs equals more welfare. And we measure unemployment using the unemployment rate, which is the percentage of the workforce without a job. Note that it's the percentage of the workforce, not the population. The workforce being the population that is both willing and able to work. Thirdly, low and stable inflation. For a macroeconomy to function effectively and to maximise the welfare of citizens, we want to ensure consistent prices to guarantee confidence in future decisions. We measure inflation using the percentage change in price indices that attempt to get an average level of prices in the economy. The 2 big ones we'll meet later in the course are the Consumer Price Index and the Retail Price Index, CPI and RPI. Our 4th objective is a surplus or a balance on the current account of the balance of payments, which we'll talk much more about in topic 9, but essentially means that we want there to be at least as much money coming into the economy from the rest of the world as there is going out. One other key indicator we use to measure the health of the macroeconomy is productivity, which is output per unit of input. It's a measure of how effective we are at making stuff. And that's really important to measure because it determines a lot of our other objectives. We most often talk about labour productivity, which is the addition to GDP for an extra hour worked by the average worker in the economy. If we're going to understand how the economy works really well, we need to look at index numbers, which are one of the key ways in which we measure the economy. Most of our objectives can be measured using index numbers, particularly inflation. These are numbers where we take raw data and we scale it to allow comparisons in growth. But because of the way we've scaled it, we can't directly compare levels. We assign our data a base year, where all of the different data series equal 100. All of our changes are relative to this, and because it's all relative, there are no units. For example, suppose we were to look at the GDP per capita data here from 2 different countries. They've been turned into index numbers, and you can see that the base year is 2010. Now, we could say, for example, that GDP per capita grew more in country 1. It went from 100 to 115, whereas in country 2, it went from 100 to 108. But we can't therefore necessarily say that GDP per capita is higher in country 1, although it's 115 in 2015 versus 108. Because the data has been scaled, we don't know if that means it's actually higher. We need to understand that key point with index numbers, and occasionally we'll need to make a couple of key conversions, converting nominal GDP into real GDP, or converting GDP in a year into GDP per capita. The same process applies for both. We're just going to plug our index numbers into the formulae that are on the screen. If we're going to understand how these different macroeconomic indicators work, we need to understand how the economy fits together. And our most simple way of understanding this is the circular flow model. We're going to relate different flows of money between firms, the people who make stuff, and households, consumers, people who buy stuff. On the one hand, consumers spend money on firms and in return receive goods and services. At the same time, households send factors of production to firms, labour in particular, but also capital, in return for some income. And that's our basic movement of factors of production, goods and services, and money around the economy. But there's also some leakages, some withdrawals from the circular flow, money that leaves the circular flow that won't go round again. Saving, for instance, taxes and imports all represent money that is taken out of this cycle. There are also some injections. Investment, government spending and exports represent money coming into the circular flow that wasn't already going round. Macroeconomic equilibrium occurs when these equal each other. Our leakages equal our withdrawals. So our savings, our taxation and our imports are the same as our investment, government spending and exports. Income in this circular flow is really key. Income is the pounds that are earned by households, expenditure is the pounds that they spend, and output is the value of pounds that is produced. And in the circular flow, we can see that income equals expenditure equals output in a macroeconomy. Because every time I spend £1, somebody else is earning that £1. And when I spend that £1, I'm also buying £1 of output. The three equal each other. And that leads us on to our last chunk of this fundamentals topic, which is looking at national income. That's the stuff that's circulating around the circular flow. Or in other words, it's the output produced by an economy. And because we've just seen that income and output and expenditure are all the same in an economy, that means we can calculate national income by adding up any of those three things. And in fact, the Office of National Statistics in the UK uses all of these methods to try and approximate national income. GDP, gross domestic product, is the most common measure of national income. And as a measure of national income and as a measure of welfare, it has some pros and cons. GDP is the main way in which we measure the health of an economy, but we need to know some advantages and disadvantages of that. The limitations of GDP as a measure of welfare boil down into two things. They boil down into the limitations of GDP as a measure of national income and the limitations of national income itself as a measure of welfare. GDP is an imperfect measure of national income because of measurement error. There's so much data it's hard to get on top of it. Because of the shadow economy, parts of the economy that are illegal or unreported that we can't measure. Some economic activity is non-monetized. Things that we do for each other that do count as economic activity, but there's no money changing hands. And some economic activity is just hard to measure. For example, free services, like mobile apps that are free. Of course it's economic activity, but it's hard to put a price on it. But even if we could measure national income perfectly, national income doesn't perfectly correspond to welfare. And remember, governments and economies are all about maximising welfare. That's because national income doesn't tell us anything about inequality, who it is that gains the money. It doesn't necessarily tell us about happiness. Income and happiness don't tend to perfectly correlate. And it also doesn't distinguish between goods and services that are good and are bad. They're all weighted equally. All of that being said, though, GDP does have some real advantages, which is why it's used. Fundamentally, because national income is the best single measure we have of economic welfare, even if it's perhaps not perfect. Especially because we can adjust it for the size of the population and for inflation and for other things like that. It's a pretty good measure of economic welfare. And GDP is a very good measure of national income, even if it's not perfect. Not least because we have these three methods of calculation. That's a very quick overview of all that we need to know in this topic, obviously missing out a lot of detail.